Very good. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I am Anatol Lieven. I'm director of the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. For those of you not acquainted with the Quincy, we are a relatively new think tank in Washington, 4 years old now, and we are dedicated to the principle of restraint in US and foreign and security policy and opposition to the pursuit of US global primacy by military and coercive means. So that is our mission. We are also entirely non-partisan. We are not affiliated with any party in the United States or anywhere else. So the topic of today's panel is surely one of the most important in the world today, which is public opinion within Ukraine and the war there. Something which it is both now very difficult to investigate, but also crucially important to investigate. And to explore this, we have three extremely interesting panelists. Dr. Volodymyr Ishchenko is a Ukrainian associate at the Freie Universitaet Berlin, and he has an illustrious record of publications on protest movements, social movements, revolution, and nationalism. Professor Gerard Toal is a political geographer at Virginia Tech, and author, amongst other books, of The Near Abroad, Putin, the West, and the Contest for Ukraine and the Caucasus. And Albina Kovalyova is a British documentary filmmaker, now working for the BBC, and her latest documentary, about which she will speak today, is called Occupied, and it's a personal account of a family living under Russian occupation in eastern Ukraine. So to begin, I would like to ask Volodymyr to speak on public opinion and attitudes to NATO in Ukraine.
Yes, thank you so much, Anatol. I hope you see my slides. Excited to speak at this panel, and I'll try to focus on the very specific topic about how Ukrainians have seen accession to NATO. Obviously, this is one of the biggest topics behind all the discussions about the war, because one side believe that accession of Ukraine to NATO could be a reason to start a bloody invasion. Another side appeal to Ukrainian agency. And unfortunately, both sides did not actually discuss what Ukrainians have been thinking about NATO. And this very, very specific topic would actually help to understand better what the internal diversity within Ukraine have been changing and how it may look like right now. How the polls in Ukraine have been used for political purposes and how politics was related to the actual opinion, and also the methodological problems now with polling in Ukraine. And I'm going to discuss this on the case of the NATO attitudes. So starting from even before the Euromaidan times, and this is a thing that within the expert community is probably very well known, but I'm not sure how well it is known for the broader public, but before 2014, only a very small minority within Ukraine supported accession to NATO. So to this question, which I think it's one of a better way to frame the question about NATO, which is the best way to guarantee the national security and provide some of the realistic options. So before invasion, this was NATO, or the military alliance with Russia, or staying neutral within a non-aligned status. So in 2007, 19% said that they would like Ukraine to join NATO. As probably some know, in 2008, in spring, there was this famous Bucharest summit of NATO when George W. Bush kind of like pushed forward the decision to grant, or at least to invite Ukraine to NATO in some distant time in future. And this was actually decided contrary to the beliefs of the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians. So, of course, then the events of 2014 happened, the Euromaidan revolution, Crimea annexation, the war in Donbass with significant involvement of Russia, obviously, and a very large part of Ukrainians started to see NATO much more positively, as perhaps as the protection against Russia. At the same time, the public opinion polls started to, basically they didn't include the Ukrainian citizens in the annexed Crimea, and also the residents of so-called Donbass and Lugansk People's Republics, as they existed before 2022. And obviously, about 1 million of Ukrainians who take refuge in Russia from Donbass. And also very important that there were obviously methodological and technical reasons not to poll, or at least there were difficulties to poll in Crimea and non-controlled parts of Donbass. However, there were also political reasons behind that, and I believe they were at least equally important, considering the constant outrages about polling in so-called occupied areas, and considerations about how different and divergent opinions are becoming in Donbass, Crimea, in contrast to the bigger part of Ukraine. Another thing to note at this graph is that the former supporters of NATO, former supporters of the union with military union with Russia, they moved rather to the non-aligned status, rather to the NATO supporters. And the diversity, the regional diversity of the opinions within Ukraine about NATO remained quite significant. So if before 2014, basically there was no majority in any region of Ukraine in support of NATO, after 2014, in the Western region, there was a very clear and stable and strong majority in support of NATO. However, if you look at the southeastern regions, and Donbass, we would see that actually the support for a non-aligned status for Ukraine was more popular in those parts. And obviously in Crimea and Donbass, those people, those Ukrainian citizens who actually were retaining their passports until very recently, they were not in support of NATO. And that's how the attitudes were kind of like fluctuating during the post-2014 times. This is the polls from another company, Quincy Institute, the International Institute of Sociology, who asked about how the people in Ukraine would vote at a potential referendum to join NATO. And the blue line is actually a vote in support. So we see kind of like fluctuation in 48% maximum. And the orange line is against NATO, which showed that there were less people like this, but there was still quite considerable minority against NATO of over 30%. And obviously, a very large portion were hesitating or did not know. So in any case, we didn't see a very clear evidence of any stable majority for NATO, even though a referendum would probably obviously decide in favor. And again, about politics, in 2018, the former president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, pushed through the parliament a decision to change the constitution of Ukraine and inscribe there the aspirations to join NATO at the moment when there was no evidence of any stable and strong support for NATO within the Ukrainian society. And again, we are not taking into account Crimea and Donbass. Nobody cared about them. And post-invasion in 2022, as we could expect, of course, the support for NATO increased, and this is one of the polls that asked, again, in a different formulation, would you like Ukraine to become member state of NATO, and would you expect Ukraine to become a member state of NATO? And in August 2022, showed 79% in support of NATO, and as you can see, the regional differences were much smaller than they were before. And here, of course, a big narrative emerges about like ultimate and total kind of like end of all that discussions about Western and Eastern Ukraine, that irreconcilable cleavage that is indeed essentialized and is obviously instrumentalized by Russia. However, it was a reality until very recently. And it's actually a question to in which directions this reality is changing. So again, what we know and what we do not know from the polls that are conducted now in Ukraine, the thing that if before the invasion, the polls typically did not include Crimea and a part of Donbass, now they do not include even larger portion of Ukrainian citizens who refuged from Ukraine either to European Union, or quite many now in Russia, or in a smaller minority in some other countries, and they are not included into the surveys. Although these are not just simply random people from Ukraine; these are predominantly women, because the males are not allowed to leave the country. And these are predominantly more of the high educated women. And these are mostly the people from the southeastern regions who have been affected by the war much heavier than the western regions. And so the opinions within the group of the refugees are not exactly the same as of the people who remained in Ukraine. And so this is one of the examples of the polls that actually try to include both the Ukrainians within Ukraine and also the refugees, because this is a panel survey which is conducted via mobile application. So they were actually capable to survey those who left for the EU. And within this poll, we see again, maybe that was quite early after the invasion, April 2022, but 49% are saying that yes, they would like Ukraine to become a member of NATO, which is many, but not a solid majority behind that. And then another issue, the way we are asking these questions about NATO, a specific formulation starts to affect the outcomes probably more significantly than it was before, and that's one of the outcomes of the decrease in reliability of the polls during the wartime. If you start to ask questions differently, for example, if you go deeper and ask the people, let's say United States, Britain, France, Germany would provide strong security guarantees for Ukraine. Would you accept this without Ukraine becoming a member state of NATO? Or whatsoever you believe that only the membership in NATO may provide security for Ukraine. So the orange part, 42%, actually say that security guarantees without NATO would be okay. For about the same number of people, 39%, the blue part of the circle, NATO is important as an identity, fundamentally. So they say that only NATO would provide security for Ukraine. However, about the same part is actually more pragmatic about this issue. And if we add more options that are possible and that are actually discussed among the policymakers, Ukraine joining NATO, or maybe some alliance with the United States only, or maybe strategic defense cooperation without United States, or non-alliance status, or building something like Israel or Switzerland model, you would see that the attitudes are actually quite diverse, especially in the southern and eastern regions, where this model of Israel and Switzerland is actually quite popular in south, almost as the NATO option. And on the national scale, at this poll, the support of NATO was again 49%, which is many, but not a strong, solid majority. And finally, about a funny thing that maybe is not exactly realized by the people who start to wave different polls figures from Ukraine is the extent of how probably emotionally people respond to the questions at this moment, and how the extent of the social desirability is affecting the outcomes in the polls. So this is the question that asks the people, how do you assess not some abstract international thing like NATO, where like 20-30% usually answered, we do not know, but economic situation in Ukraine, which should be something more closer to the everyday life of the people. And the pollsters compare the answers to the same question in November 2021, just before the invasion, and in December 2022, almost a year after the invasion. The yellow is 2021 answers, the red are the 2022 answers. And they ask the people to evaluate the economic situation from 0 to 10. 0 is worse, 10 is better. And you can see that before the invasion, people tended to think about economical situation in Ukraine much worse than after the invasion, despite over 30% of decline in GDP, despite the hike in unemployment, despite regular power cuts because of the Russian bombings of the cities. So there is a very strong incentive to believe that Ukraine can win, that Ukraine will survive, that Ukraine will overcome, that everything is going actually better. And these emotions, this reasoning is fully understandable, but this is also a question to which extent the stories right now are reliable, and what we can know and what we cannot know from them. So coming to the conclusions, just to reiterate several points that I believe are very important to understand the public opinion in Ukraine. So we should be very clear that polls could be used as a tool to study public opinion, and of course for different academic purposes, but they are also a tool to construct public opinion, both within Ukraine and also internationally, when they're starting to be used in the policy discussions by politicians, by journalists, and so on and so forth, which quite often do not use those polls reflectively and do not discuss all the issues surrounding the polls. Then, again, the political question, within Ukraine, it has the actual politics was decided not necessarily by the majorities, and sometimes even against the overwhelming majorities, as on the question of NATO during several periods in Ukrainian history. And we should be aware not only which public is more popular, but also which public is better organized, is better mobilized, and is better politically represented. And it looks like that the pro-NATO camp was actually better organized, mobilized, and represented than the camp for non-aligned status. After the invasion, I believe we can more reliably judge about the trends in the public opinion polls, rather than use the figure from polls as some kind of like an absolute and precise fact. This is much less reliable, and I think the discussion about the problems should point to this direction.
Thank you so much, Volodymyr. We have to go on to the next speaker now, but that was most interesting, and it does illustrate, of course, both my own experience as a journalist, the critical importance of asking the right question, but also the grave folly of using formulae like the American people, the Ukrainian people, and so forth. So thank you very much. Gerard, your conclusions.
Okay, thank you for the invitation to speak. So I want to share my screen here, and so just bear with me as I get that sorted. Okay, and so I have a little timer here, so I'm going to limit myself to be very, very quick. Some of you may see 18 slides. That's way too many. I should be able to get through them. I'm not going to get through all 18. So first of all, the important thing to bear in mind about public opinion in wartime is that it is very difficult to judge, and it's overwhelmed by a rally around the flag attitudes. Wartime violence brings out polarizations and brings out processes of identity, polarization, strong emotions, and then very hardline attitudes towards territory and very specific attitudes towards what peace and what peace would look like. So I'm going to tack between polls that my colleagues and I have conducted. We have worked with the Kiev International Institute of Sociology here, and there are two types. There's the first polls, which are phone polls, which are trying to get at nationally representative, but of course it's not nationally representative. It is of those areas that are controlled by Kiev. So there are lots of areas, as Volodymyr pointed out, that are excluded, and people that are excluded whose voices need to be heard also. And then there's the second type, which is a series of face-to-face interviews in frontline cities that Kiev did for us this summer. So just to show you some kind of sense of the degree to which there's a massive sort of schismogenesis. There's a real othering of Ukraine is defining itself, its identity in opposition to Russia. And so this is a set of slides which show perceptions of the Russia-Ukraine moral boundary, where Ukrainians are defining themselves strongly in opposition to Russia and even to Russians. So Ukraine and Russians have similar morals, strongly disagree. Ukrainians are spiritually stronger than Russians, strongly agree, and so on and so forth. That's part of the rallying process. It's part of this process of a definition of the group and the community in opposition to Russia. That then has implications for how people understand the war. The war is an invasion. The war is an attack on Ukraine. It's an attack on Ukrainian identity. It's attacking Ukrainian territory. And so then when you ask people about what are the choices that the Ukrainian government should take at this time, and this is from a poll that Keith did for us in, I think it was April, May, and you have a strong majority that say that the policy that a Ukrainian government should adopt is opposing Russian identity until all of Ukraine, including Crimea, is under Kiev's control. 61% say that. So there's a strong attitude that the undivided national territory is an essential value for the Ukrainian nation. This sense that Ukraine is a victim here. Ukraine needs to get all its territory back in order for there to be a just end to this war. And then what does that mean in terms of life and territory? And I've with my colleagues tried to pursue this particular really tragic dilemma between territory and life here. And it depends, as you mentioned, Anatol, on the question you ask. So because of the sacrifice of the Ukrainian soldiers, so if you front load that in terms of sacrifice, it is more important than ever that Ukraine never concede any territory. Strong agreement here. And now this is in Zaporizhia, Poltava, and Dnipro. So it's not nationally representative, but I think it's important and indicative. Then to the issue of geopolitical orientation. My colleagues and I in 2019 did a face-to-face survey actually in Ukraine of 2,200 people. We then redid that in 2022 with the help of Keys, but this time it was a phone survey, and we asked the same questions. And there's a significant change. So where should Ukraine be in a 10-point scale? This is 2019. You see, the majority of people say it should be in the middle here. By 2020, and it's not the same, completely the same group, overwhelmingly here. You have towards the West. So you have a significant shift in geopolitical attitudes. Now, we tried to ask the same people as we asked in 2019. We weren't able to do that. We found only 429 of those. But of those that we found, they had significantly changed their attitudes. So you have the same people changing their attitudes. And this is research that others have also found, kind of findings that are reproduced by others. Declining sentiment for neutrality within Ukraine. Majority sentiment in 2019 is that Ukraine should be neutral and stay out of military alliances. By 2020. That is rejected. So that also is an important, significant finding. Now, we run the danger when we're talking about Ukraine, and we're falling into it already, where we're geopoliticizing everything and we're thinking of geopolitical categories. So I and my colleagues wanted to ask about, how significant is geopolitics for people? And so we asked people about this in response to asked them this statement, and what do they think of this statement? First and foremost, we should be concerned about our own life and well-being, not questions of territory or geopolitics. And as you can see, there's a strong kind of division amongst people about this. There are some who believe that territory and questions of geopolitics nowadays are really, really important in wartime Ukraine. But there's others that are saying, no, it's life and well-being. That's part of the tragic dilemma. And then when you get to this question and rephrase the whole idea of how should you deal with the fact that the war is just coming at a tremendous cost to the young Ukrainians who are fighting on the front lines and dying there. So then we put it in a different way. This is asking a different type of questions. Imperative to seek a ceasefire to stop Russians from killing Ukrainian young men. You can see there's majority sentiment. It's not overwhelming, but it's a tragic dilemma of ending the war in order to save lives. So that's, I think, the important thing that we need to get out of this, rather than simply just there's a massive geopolitical change. There is a geopolitical change. It's the degree to which it's massive is, and the degree to which it lasts is an open question. But there are really serious and tragic dilemmas here. So let me end with two cautions. In our own geopolitical culture and how we're interpreting Ukraine, I think there's significant dangers, and Volodymyr has pointed out to one of these, and that is, and I take an example here, an op-ed by Boris Johnson recently in the Washington Post, where he's saying, before 2014, you can certainly make the argument that Ukrainian population was divided on NATO membership, but look at the numbers now, 83%. What he doesn't point out is that the numbers 83% are only on part of Ukraine. That excludes Crimea. That excludes the parts of the Donbass that Russia controls, and it excludes the areas that the Russian army have subsequently occupied. So the degree to which this is representative is seriously problematic. So these types of loose uses of the statistics and of public opinion, the degree to which there's a homogenization or a desire to homogenize the Ukrainian people and to insert them into our own desired heroic visions of the Ukrainians fighting for freedom and the like, fighting on the front line. I think that's part of what we need to be very questioning of in our own culture. The second one is a different form of motivated reasoning, and that concerns Crimea, which is claimed but not heard. We don't, I'll give you an example. This is a very good piece by Patrick Winter from December, but he, in the course of talking about Crimea, he says, no reliable opinion polls have been carried out since the occupation. Well, my colleagues and I have done 2 different public opinion polls in Crimea since the occupation, since it was annexed, using Levada, which is the leading independent survey company in Russia. And both of those surveys provide what are inconvenient facts, which are that the annexation in Crimea was broadly popular amongst the population. Now, that is not in any way to justify the annexation. It's simply to provide a report of facts. And those kind of facts are really important for democratic deliberation on this particular very, very complicated issue. In general, I'm a geographer, this very, very famous tweet by Canada at NATO from 2014, where it says geography can be tough, and here's a guide. Well, geography can be really, really tough, and it's much tougher than 2 choropleth maps going up against each other, where you have a clear divide between territories. What we see in Crimea, what we see in Ukraine writ large, is something that political geographers have been studying for a long time, and it is a process that has occurred in the British Isles, in my own country, in Ireland, with the status of Ulster. It's also something that I saw when I spent 10 years studying the war in Bosnia. After the breakup of Yugoslavia. There are general processes here. They're messy. They're involve kind of a terrible violence, and there are, in this particular case, extremely dangerous because of the, as you pointed out in a recent piece, Anatol, because Crimea is potentially ticking time bomb in terms of it's the degree to which, if Ukraine was to seek to liberate that territory, that would trigger Russia to turn to nuclear weapons, which would be absolutely horrible for, first and foremost, Ukraine and all of us. So I will stop on that rather somber note.
Thank you so much. I mean, as a half Irish Brit myself, I've always been astonished by the British and the French failure to draw, any lessons from their own imperial and post-imperial experiences for what has happened in the former Soviet Union. But anyway, Albina.
Thank you, Anatol, for inviting me to the panel. So I'm a little bit. What the 2 reports you guys produced are a little bit different from what I do. I focus on specific individuals, and my documentary Occupied is exactly going into the territory that you both mentioned of occupied and annexed territories, which there's basically an information vacuum. There's not much known about how people feel, especially the territories that have been annexed previously, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. But from the beginning of the war in 2022, it became clear that Kherson was going to become a very interesting and important new place, and that a very similar kind of thing was going to happen, so that, as the Russians took control, there would be very little information about what was happening inside. And as the pressure would grow, it would be very difficult to understand how people felt inside. So I found a local character who started documenting the world around him. He was a local journalist, and he filmed the events on the ground, and also his own personal reflections and reactions to the events, which are very moving. But basically, it shows a pretty sizable resistance to the occupation at the beginning. And as the clampdown continued, people became detained, disappeared. It became very dangerous to speak about anything that was not pro-Russian. So this was documented, and basically it became a decline of the Ukrainian identity in a public way until the liberation of Kherson. But the film finished. The filming was finished before that happened. So I'm going to try and show a little clip of the film to give you an idea. Please bear with me. Sorry, I don't know if this is going to actually work. I'm going to try. Maybe it's not going to work. Anyway, if you would like to watch the full version of the film, it's on the BBC World service iPlayer. Sorry, not iPlayer, YouTube, which is available around the world, and you can see it in the US. But basically, yes, I think the issue with the occupied territories and the annexed territories is a complicated one. I have no idea how you would tackle it, given that, it's so dangerous for people to speak their minds. And I think I don't have much more to say, because I haven't studied in the same way that you have conducted your research, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions just based on the experience I have and the material that I've seen.
Thank you so much. Well, maybe I could ask the first question, which is, when the Russian invasion started, it was clear that Moscow expected large numbers of Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine to support the invasion. Now, that does not appear to have happened, certainly not among their elected representatives. Has there been any recognition of that fact? At the beginning, there seemed to be, but today within Ukraine, is that something which is still celebrated, or increasingly is the Russian population within Ukraine lumped with Russia itself as enemies? Well,
sorry, is this question directed at somebody in particular, or to all of us?
Whoever would like to answer.
Let me just jump in. I was astounded that the invasion was premised upon the notion that there would be support amongst Ukrainians for a Russian invasion beyond the Donbass. My colleagues and I had done a pretty extensive work, and I'm talking about ZOAS here in Germany, trying to get at a sentiment in the Donbass across both parts of the line. And it was quite clear that it actually made a difference when you did phone surveys, what particular mobile phone company you were using. because certain mobile phone companies were associated with Ukraine and others were associated with the occupation authorities. What we found is that there was, in the areas that the Russia controlled, in the Donbass, there was significant support for the local authorities, not overwhelming support, but there was also significant support for a plague on both their houses on both sides of the line. There was no support, or very, very little support for any kind of a sentiment of support for Russia beyond the areas in the beyond the Donbass, the areas that they ended up taking in Zaporizhia and Kherson and Mykolaiv. No, this was, so I was astounded by that. Why was the intelligence so bad? And, corruption, the fifth, there was a whole scandal surrounding the Fifth Directorate, and they were supposed to be doing polls and quote unquote preparing the ground. Zelensky was unpopular, but the kind of fluctuations of a leader was no sentiment that you could judge the legitimacy of the state. So why that happened, I don't know. We will just have to find out. But certainly it was massive blunder in terms of intelligence. And, kudos to the State Department, who were reading polls too, who said Ukrainians would resist. And the INR folks in the State Department dissented from the general sentiment in the intelligence community that the Russians were going to roll over the Ukrainians. And in that sense, they, by looking at public opinion polling, they got it right. But having said that, it was also like an extremely close-run thing in the early days.
Albina, do you think that's right from your own observations?
Well, I mean, in Kherson, I think it was pretty clear, this disconnect, because the stories I heard, firsthand were of soldiers coming in and saying to people, but we're here to help you, to liberate you. And people would say, well, we don't need your help. We're living just fine. And it was, and really, I think this narrative shocked maybe even some of the Russian soldiers that came in, because they were prepared for, a huge welcoming. And of course, the Russian state propaganda and other kinds of propaganda on, social media, etc., portrayed it in that way, that still, the people were so thankful for their rescue and liberation of the Nazi government, or whatever they say about it. But I think it was just not the case. And I think that people power, you see scenes, and actually some of these are in a film, where, you've got a grandmother saying, go home, I live just fine and I will deal with my authorities myself. Why are you here to liberate me? And I think for a lot of Russian soldiers, it was also even quite shocking to see, based on the reports, the level of life that people are living. They're not hugely prosperous, but actually, it's all quite orderly, and there's a very, not nice food growing, and it's quite a lovely region of Ukraine, the south. So yeah, I think it's a very strange kind of meeting of the two narratives and the friction between them.
Volodymyr?
Yeah, thank you. Just a few thoughts on this. I think first that discussing this Russian blunder about the misjudging how they would be accepted in Ukraine after the invasion, I think we too much focus on the polls. But the biggest mistake that they made, they misjudged the attitudes and behavior of the Ukrainian elites within the state apparatus, within the military, within the Ukraine security service, which overwhelmingly stood behind Ukraine. And this is not exactly what is measured in the polls, but it was much more important for Russian initial plan to take a large part of Ukraine with quite limited forces. That would be only possible with massive collaboration from the elites, which didn't happen. And then how it discussed in Ukraine, discussed in quite simplistic terms. There is Ukrainian people, which fights against the aggressor, and there are also the fifth column, the collaborationists, the traitors, against which the Ukraine Security Service particularly fights their important work. But then it's of course the question where we draw this line between the people and the enemies of the people. And here a discussion which is, I think it's, fortunately it's not developed enough. If before the invasion, we called a significant part of Ukraine's population pro-Russian, for example, because they were supporting the non-aligned status for Ukraine and not NATO, or they were supporting the Minsk Accords, or they were voting for the opposition platform, which was treated as a pro-Russian party. And now after the invasion, we see that the majority of that opposition platform, the overwhelming majority, besides a very few figures, actually supported Zelensky and Ukraine, and for understandable reasons, because their property and voters are within Ukraine and not in Russia. And we see that those people who supported non-aligned status, they're also for Ukraine and not for the invasion. That should call us to actually reconsider a lot of the analysis of the pre-invasion Ukraine, and whether there was a possibility to actually recognize the diversity within Ukraine and without stigmatizing a very organic Ukrainian position as a pro-Russian.
Mm. We have a question from Maria Petkova. There have been some commentators who have suggested that if President Zelensky agreed to negotiations for peace with Russia or a ceasefire, that would be a political suicide for him, given the reaction within Ukraine against that. Based on your work and the material you presented or have seen, do you think that this picture is accurate, that Zelensky would face a colossal backlash against any move towards a ceasefire or a peace settlement? Gerard?
So Volodymyr can answer that better than I in terms of the current dynamics. What I can tell you is that in the survey research that we did in the three frontline cities, we asked, we did what's called an endorsement experiment, where we asked, we give people a question which said, that Ukraine should seek a generic statement. Ukraine should seek a ceasefire. And then we put an endorsement. European leaders say Ukraine should seek a ceasefire. What do you think? Zelensky says, Zelensky's endorsement of that sentiment significantly moves it from minority sentiment to majority sentiment. European leader endorsement of it reduces it from the more generic support statement. Now, that's a limited survey experiment, but what I took from that, and my colleagues too, is that Zelensky has significant framing power. The question is whether he's going to use it, and that gets at the degree to which he can move towards extremely difficult situation. Anatol, you'll know from Irish history, when you have someone like Michael Collins, who suddenly is in a treaty negotiation and ends up endorsing a treaty which divides the country. He said, "I'm signing my death warrant." He's shot in a civil war that follows. Whether Ukraine follows that model, I hope not. But Volodymyr and Albina, you can weigh in on this issue.
Let me try to answer this question. Although I'm not sure I'll provide a yes or no answer. So that was exactly one of my points, the relation between the public opinion as we see in the polls and the actual politics, and to the extent of how the political decision makers ignore or instead exploit the polls numbers. So, of course, we may answer that obviously, because the surveys show that over 80, over 90% of Ukrainians would not accept any concessions to Russia at this moment, we may assume that there would be a large backlash against any attempt to negotiate with Russia, which is possible. At the same time, if you look at the very recent history, and partially I discussed it about how unpopular NATO was, but instead of that, Ukrainian politicians and foreign politicians, they were pushing this agenda, and eventually they may be successful, or at least they won the majority support within Ukraine for NATO, or at least to the extent we can trust the polls at this moment. And for Zelensky himself, what the majority believed or what they opposed was not exactly the primary factor of his decisions. So Zelensky, for example, pushed quite straightforwardly a very unpopular reform of Ukrainian land market, which was opposed by over 70% of the population. Something like relatively comparable to how the people opposed any negotiations with Russia now, at least on the level of figures. There could be, if you go deeper, there could be much stronger emotions, obviously, behind the land issue and behind the war issue. But nevertheless, what could be more important than the figures within the polls is the questions of mobilization, of organization, and political representation, so very specific opinions within the public.
Albina?
I mean, yes, I don't have any polls that I could possibly appeal to, but I think it is indeed a very important point that is raised. You know, how do we find the way out of it, and to what extent do Ukrainian people accept any kind of negotiation at a time when, you know, they are deeply traumatized by a war that their neighbor has waged upon them? And I think that is, you know, that is one of the key questions. I couldn't possibly answer it. I think it's one of the key questions that no one can answer, but clearly at some point there must be a kind of negotiation to end this war, and whether or not all of the people support President Zelensky and all the other sides trying for peaceful resolution, you know, it's going to have to be done, possibly not in the support. Perhaps he will not survive after that, but that's you know, that's a kind of historical question that I don't think at this point we can quite judge. I'm sorry, I don't have any insight. I think it's hugely, you know, it's up to the Ukrainian people to decide when the time comes and the specific terms are set.
But would you say, because there's a question from Maria Zulkina about attitudes in the occupied areas. One would assume, but this is only an assumption, of course, that there's a very different attitude, you know, on the one hand in Crimea and the eastern Donbass, from the areas where you based your documentary, which is the areas of Russia occupied last year. But I mean, as I say, that's an assumption. Is there any, you know, any? I know it's appallingly difficult or impossible to do this kind of work now, but would you say that is a reasonable assumption, that in terms of different attitudes to Russia, to NATO?
I think they are all quite different. I mean, Crimea is, you know, a special case, I think, in terms of the population and how they feel, and also for Russians, the significance of Crimea. In the Donbass, which has been annexed or occupied since 2014 and 15, I would say that those, you know, those who had a kind of different opinion, they have either left or been silenced. And I think, you know, to a large extent, it's happened in the occupied territories, recently occupied territories, where, I mean, in Kherson, it's like, even now it's been liberated. There's only 20% of the people that remain, you know, so the rest of them are scattered. So how would you possibly, you know, gather them together to see how they feel about it? And of course, lots of people have left the country. Lots of Ukrainians have fled to Russia, and whatever their opinion is, I am sure the majority of them wouldn't dare and speak publicly in a country which, you know, has on the one hand attacked them, on the other hand provide them some sort of haven. So I think in the occupied territories, even the ones that are newly occupied, there's such a reign of terror, and this is Russia's tactic to the areas it takes over, that, you know, people wouldn't dare at this stage. I mean, the individuals who do dare present their position are punished pretty swiftly. I don't know how you would get around that. I think that's why you have to look at it in a different way and try and find, you know, a kind of you know, the personal story that could illustrate a situation for many and be a representation. I think it's that kind of situation. But certainly that's what I've tried to do in the absence of having the voices that could speak for themselves, other voices anyway.
You know, speaking as a former journalist myself, it's about all one can do in these circumstances. I mean, it would obviously be ridiculous to expect any kind of systematic, you know, scientific approach. Two very last questions on methodology. In these surveys, did you examine the impact of variables such as individual losses, death of loved ones, etc., in terms of attitudes to the war? And a question from Jonathan Steele: you showed figures for IDP's views that a ceasefire is preferable to continuing the war, i.e. life is more valuable than territory. Do you have you been able to differentiate those figures for the same issue among non-IDP Ukrainians? Gerard?
Yeah, those are really great questions. First of all, you know, the survey work that was done in the frontline cities was done in July. Situation has got even worse there. Dnipro has been pounded almost daily. There were attacks when the surveys were happening, but it's got a lot worse. What we found, and you know, this is only one survey, is that if someone had lost a personal friend or relative, a family member, they had much more hardline views. If you were a displaced person, however, who had lost property, you were more interested in a ceasefire. So that's sort of the war experience, which is how academics talk about it. It needs to be differentiated. And so people who had fled and maybe lost their homes and stuff like that were interested in returning, but they didn't have a trauma. Well, they had a traumatic experience, but which is being displaced. But nevertheless, they hadn't lost a loved one. And so that's, I think, worth paying attention to. And then the second aspect of the question, remind me of it again, Anatol.
I think that covers it pretty well, thank you.
Okay, all right, yeah. So, you know, violence radicalizes people. Violence has massive impacts on a society. We're going to be dealing with the trauma of this. Ukraine's going to be dealing with the trauma of this, and Russia for a long, long time. This is going to take an awful lot of healing for this to be overcome, and it's an absolute terrible situation.
Yeah, indeed it is. Well, thank you all so much. This has been, you know, extremely interesting and enlightening. To the audience, I'm very sorry that, you know, our time is limited, so I haven't been able to get around to all the questions. But thank you very much for listening in. And just to say, our next panel will be on February the 23rd next week, and it will be on the transformation of German policy since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the extent and limits of this with former German official, parliamentarian, and an American expert. So I do hope that you will be able to come to this as well. February the 23rd at noon EST. Thank you all so much. It was most interesting, and goodbye to you all.
Thank you.